Greetings. My name is Don Larson. Today we're going to talk about the history of the Internet, and we're going to talk a little bit about how the Internet works. We have a plan, so let's have a look at the plan. It's pretty short and it's pretty simple. The first thing we'll do then is talk about the history of the Internet, and secondly, we'll talk about how it works, just what I said a few seconds ago. Let's talk about the history of the Internet. In the late 1930s and the early 40s, there was a disaster happening in Europe.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns stirbt Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party had taken control in Germany after World War I, and they built the military machine in Germany back up to peak performance and began to invade some of the neighboring countries. The bright orange that you see in the center of this map is Germany's frontiers, and the lighter oranges that you see are some of the countries that they overran with this new military force. The light green areas, the Soviet Union, Algeria, and the United Kingdom, were being threatened by Germany, and World War II then was fully joined. The United States was doing everything they possibly could to stay out of this war. They were just leaving the Depression, or trying to get out of the Depression, in the late 30s, and the United States was still reeling from the amount of manpower and so forth that they'd contributed to World War I. So they were doing as much as they could to stay out. One of the most famous people that lived in Germany back in that time was a scientist by the name of Albert Einstein. And in 1905, Albert Einstein, then a Swiss patent attorney, had published a paper called The Theory of Relativity. In that paper, Albert Einstein had said that energy and matter were two different manifestations of the same product, of the same thing, and he said they could be converted from one to the other. The important part is, he said, the amount of energy that you could get by converting a certain amount of matter could be found by taking the amount of matter times the speed of light and then squaring that number. The speed of light, the number for the speed of light, is a huge number, and if you square it, it's even bigger. So then you can figure out in a hurry that if you do convert matter to energy, you get an awful lot of energy. When Adolf Hitler took over Germany, he and his Nazi party, Albert Einstein left just about immediately when he saw how the Jewish people were being treated. He was a Jew himself, and he found out that it wasn't a good thing to be a Jew in Germany at that time. He moved to the United States. In the United States, he took a job teaching, and some of his scientist friends contacted him about writing a letter to the President of the United States about the possibility of building an atomic bomb. He did that. Einstein signed it alone, and when he sent the letter to the President of the United States, the President took notice because of Albert Einstein's incredible, was not a happy event for the world to know that the Soviets had an atomic weapon as well.
The year is 1952. The communist revolution in Russia is 35 years old. Its living god is Joseph Stalin. He is 72 years old. His health seems excellent. His power is absolute. Before him pass thousands of his soldiers. The atmosphere in Moscow is grim, hostile. He has expelled the American ambassador. He says war with the imperialists is inevitable.
It seemed that the problem with the Soviet Union was in its leadership from the perspective of people in the free world. Joseph Stalin, although that news clip said he was in great health in 1952, died in 1953. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, everybody hoped would be a little easier to get along with. It turned out he wasn't at all. He was just as aggressive. The Soviet leaders seemed to feel that the world should be communist, and they were willing to go to any extent to make the world a communist world. In the United States, the leaders were Harry Truman from 1945 to 1952. Then the war hero General Dwight D. Eisenhower won election, and he became president from 1953 until 1961, until John F. Kennedy took over. The Cold War continued, and in fact, in the period from 1950 till 1953, it broke out into a shooting war when the country of North Korea, backed by the Soviet and Chinese communists, invaded South Korea, and the free world, including the United States, responded. A conflict was in progress there for the 3 years from 50 to 53. Then a shaky truce was signed, and the conflict was over. There were other things going on besides the Cold War, however. The U.S. announced early in the 1950s that they planned to launch a small satellite. It was going to be the size of a grapefruit and weigh about 30 pounds before the end of 1958. The reason that they wanted to launch it sometime just before the end of 1958 is because there was an unprecedented amount of solar activity that was expected, and they were going to use this satellite to study the radiation belts around the world. They were very open about the development of this satellite and the rocket that was to lift it in space. One of the biggest problems they had is the rockets didn't want to work right. The stages never seemed to work right. First stage would work, second one wouldn't. You get the idea. The stages were failing too often. In 1957, the Soviets absolutely shocked the world by launching their own satellite in complete secrecy. Compared to the 30-pound satellite that the United States planned, it was huge. It was the size of the basketball, weighed 183 pounds. The way the Soviets pulled that off is, rather than worrying about staging rockets, they strapped four of them together, touched them all off at once, and gave the projectile enough oomph so they could go into orbit. To add insult to injury, a few months later, they launched a satellite called Sputnik 2. It weighed an incredible 1,130 pounds, and besides that, it had a dog on board. The United States was successful in launching their satellite, but it was not a very big event after the two Sputniks had been up. So it seems rather strange to have the launching of Sputnik listed on a timeline that reputes to be working with computers, but it turns out that the people that were in academic research identify 1957 as one of the pivotal points in the amount of support they got for research, and much of the support they got after 1957 was due to the fact that Sputnik had been such a shock for the people that handed out money for research. For example, in 1958, an organization called ARPA was formed, and ARPA stood for the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was part of the Department of Defense. It was charged with the job of getting the United States to be #1 in technology, establish a role of leadership in technology, and the part of ARPA that we're most interested in is called the Information Processing Techniques Office, IPTO. It dealt with data communications. Meet Leonard Kleinrock. He was an instructor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 1961, he published the very first paper on packet switching communications for computers. In his research, he found that sending computer data worked a lot more efficiently if you sent it in small packets of information rather than the way that teletypes had been sending information for some time in big streams of data. So Leonard Kleinrock then published the first report that I know of about packet-switched communications for computers, up with that concept. The Cold War marched on. In 1962, in fact, it heated up a little bit when the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba right off the shores of the United States. There was no doubt in anybody's mind that these missiles could reach anywhere in the United States and put us at jeopardy. This is a picture from President Kennedy's cabinet meeting. Here's President Kennedy right here, his cabinet members. Johnson right here, Vice President Johnson, his brother Bobby Kennedy sitting right here. And they were meeting concerning this threat during the 13 days when everybody in the world thought that we were going to be in a nuclear war. It's very hard to explain exactly what the mood was in the 1960s, but looking at some of these artifacts can help a little bit. In the upper left-hand corner, you see school children hunched underneath their desks. They were in exercises. These went on all over the United States. The students were taught how they could hide underneath their desk to try and keep some of the debris from hitting them in case of a nuclear explosion somewhere in the vicinity and far enough away so it didn't obliterate them in the first blast. The Civil Defense Department was busy telling people about how they could protect themselves from radio fallout, and they even had plans that you could get absolutely free that told you how you could build your fallout shelter. There was no doubt in anyone's mind, I don't think, that nuclear war was going to happen. It was just a matter of when, and it was a matter of being prepared for a nuclear conflict. The research went on in this packet switch technology that Leonard Kleinrock had talked about. Donald Davidson in the United Kingdom was working on it at the National Physical Laboratory. That's their national standards laboratory in England. And Paul Buran independently was working on it for the RAND group of the USA. They didn't know about each other's work until both of them had done significant effort on it. But we know most about Rand's work because the outfit he worked for, the RAND Institute, still maintains a website at www.rand.org, and at that website you can find out something about the research steps that Paul Buran went to come up with his concept of what he called hot potato routing, where packet switch communications would be what we'd call it today. He looked at many different networks. He looked at a network called a centralized network, and in that type of network you had a central spot that ran all the activity. If that was wiped out, of course, that means that any of the people that were on the network. I think the closest example of that today would be some satellite-based activity where if the satellite were wiped out, all of the receivers and transceivers on the ground would be of little value. The second type of network that he looked at was a decentralized network, and this is a little better in that there's several points that are very important to the network, but still there's key locations that if you knock them out with some type of activity or another, they would make it impossible for some stations on the network to communicate with other stations on the network. Finally, the network architecture that Paul Buran came up with was called distributed networking. And in distributed networking then, you could knock out a whole bunch of the stations that make up the grid work of the network, and yet two points on the network could communicate with each other and find another path to get it to each other if they wanted to communicate. There was really no electronic network that was like this at the time Paul Buran came up with the idea. And I think the closest example of that type of network would probably be the Postal Department. And of course, it's nothing electronic about that at the time at all. But if you had a post office that burned down, for example, other post offices would take over the activity that that post office had been doing until it was repaired again. And that was just exactly the idea that Paul Buran had for his hot potato. What else was going on? Well, in 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to ever walk on the moon. Also in 1969, the fledgling ARPANET, the beginnings of the internet, was born in California. Here's Leonard Kleinrock again. He'd moved from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to UCLA, and the first interface message processor, IMP they were called, was installed at UCLA, making it the first node on the ARPANET. 2 months later, a second IMP was installed at Stanford. We've come to know these interface message processors as gateways or routers today, but at that time they were called interface message processors. So the ARPANET was off and running. By the end of 1969, there was 4 computers on the ARPANET, one at UCLA, another at UC Santa Barbara, Stanford, University of Utah. The applications started being developed right away. The first application to be of interest was one called Telnet. In a Telnet application, if you had a terminal connected to one of these computers, you could use that terminal to log on another computer and work on that computer just as though you were sitting there. The second development that was important was that of FTP. It stood for File Transfer Protocol, and that was the protocol that let 2 computers talk to each other and exchange files. And then there's a very important one called email that we'll talk a little bit more about later. In 1970, Norman Abramson left California because he found out he absolutely loved to surf. The best place to do that was in Hawaii. He took a job as an electrical engineer at the University of Hawaii, found out that the various campuses on the islands in Hawaii had really poor communications between their computers. So he applied to ARPA for some money to build a packet radio network. So the ARPANET then had components of it that were radio-based very, very early in its history. In 1972, the first email was born. It was born as the brainchild of a guy by the name of Raymond S. Tomlinson. He was an electrical engineer that worked for Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. They were the company that won the contract for making all of the IMPs that the ARPANET was so dependent on. He had a program that had been used in time-shared computers for messaging, and he took another program that moved files between ARPANET computers. When he got all done, he had an email program, and it's he that decided that the @ symbol would be the symbol that would separate an email address from the host name, a username from the host name. What else was going on? Well, in 1972, there was some electronic surveillance equipment that was installed in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Later on, there was quite a fuss that was made about that surveillance equipment. What else was going on in 1977? Well, Jimmy Carter was elected president, took office. There was a little show that came out called Star Wars that broke all kinds of box office records. There was an icon that died when Elvis passed away in 1977. And another thing that happened was the public could all of a sudden buy personal computers that weren't in kit form. There had been some kit form computers that weren't very useful and very hard to put together. But all of a sudden, 3 new computers appeared on the market in 1977. The Apple II could be purchased for $1,298. You still needed a screen of some type, and your color TV at home would work just fine. The Commodore PET came with a screen, and it also had a cassette deck built into it for storage, $795. And the Tandy TRS-80, $600 from the leather company that it became a electronics store. And then in 1979, 2 years later, a couple of graduate students at the Harvard Business School got together and decided they wanted to make a new kind of program. Dan Bricklin actually, on the right, actually came up with the idea for a spreadsheet, and he enlisted the aid of his programmer friend Bob Frankston. Together they made the first spreadsheet program called VisiCalc. If you're interested in seeing what VisiCalc looks like, or if you saw one time and want to see it again, if you do a Google search or something of that nature on the internet for VisiCalc, you will very easily find the spot where you can download one of the original VisiCalc programs. Strangely enough, it's only about 28K, and it's a working model of VisiCalc that will work on your IBM compatible computer. It's kind of fun to play with it. The directions are on the web as well. Spreadsheets have come a long ways, but VisiCalc was a huge, huge invention in 1979. Suddenly these personal computers that had seemed like toys became very important to people that were in business. They could make what-if spreadsheets with VisiCalc, and suddenly CEOs were buying personal computers simply because they wanted VisiCalc. Of course, word processing programs were developed shortly thereafter too. In 1981, IBM came into the PC market. And this was a very important event, not because the PC was so great. The PC was actually kind of mediocre. But when Big Blue, the big computer company, started making computers like the other people did, personal computers, it gave the personal computer the boost that it needed in business. The original PC had 18K of memory, and it cost $1,565. By the way, that did not buy the monitor. You still had to buy the monitor for that amount. When the PCs first got on the internet, they were used more like terminals than anything else. They were used to log on to a larger computer, and they actually kind of fulfilled the reality of this picture that I showed you earlier when I qualified that, saying that the things that looked like PCs were actually just CRTs and keyboards. Well, now, as PCs first got on the internet, they did, in fact, connect to a mainframe and act like a terminal. You get a terminal program like Kermit, for example, and use that to connect to a larger computer. That changed, though. In 1991, the World Wide Web was born. A guy by the name of Tim Berners-Lee from the European Organization for Nuclear Research invented the World Wide Web, and the reason he put it together was that he wanted his scientist collaborators that worked on the particle accelerator at CERN to be able to get to their graphical data and view it from their computer even when they weren't at CERN in Switzerland, when they were back in their own countries. So he put together the concept then and the reality of the World Wide Web. In 1992, a young University of Illinois student by the name of Mark Andreessen spent his Christmas vacation converting the program that was written at CERN to the PC and later to the Macintosh. Mark Andreessen later did quite well as he formed a company called Netscape and went off to do pretty well for himself.